Now, let's move then. Our time is limited. Let's move to the first of the principles I want to consider that I found having this character of universal quality. If it was part of an influence appeal, people tended to comply more frequently than if it wasn't part of that appeal. Right? And where are we in terms of the slide? Here we go. Okay. It's the principle of reciprocation. Right? There is a rule in all human societies that obligates us to give back to others the form of behavior that we have received from them. If I invite you to a party, you should invite me to one of yours. If I do you a favor, you should do me a favor in return. You're obligated. And I'll tell you very simply that in the context of obligation, people say yes to the request. There's an organization, the American Disabled Veterans Organization. They do a very good job of marketing and building a list of recipients for their standard appeals for donations so that they get an 18% hit rate when they send out their standard solicitation, which is very, very good. They've found that if they add to the envelope a little packet of personalized address labels, you know, the gummed labels on the back, costs them 9 cents. Their success rate goes from 18% to 35%. And no one sends them 9 cents. Okay. Even though they didn't want those, perhaps, I mean, I don't want them when I get them, but they've got my name on them. What am I going to do? Send them back? Nobody else can use them. So as soon as I've kept them, they've got me in the jaws of the rule that says you must not take without giving in return. You must not take without giving in return. We're taught that from childhood. Okay. For that reason, then, you will find people giving first before they ask for something from you. And sometimes it can be as small as a little packet of address labels. It's not what you received, it's the fact that you did receive that engages this rule and inclines people to say yes. It's one of the universal principles that all cultures install in their members from childhood. You must not take without giving in return. And there are people who will exploit that principle and the context of obligation that follows it. Let me say further that this principle isn't just universal across all cultures. It applies to all behaviors within any given culture. Not just to gifts and favors and services. It applies to harm, for example. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's a negative instantiation of the rule for reciprocity. But it also applies to another arena that has application to influence, and it has to do with concessions that people make to one another when they are negotiating or bargaining on some issue. If you and I start with incompatible positions on some issue, you want this, I want that, and you were to say to me, well, I'll tell you what, Bob, I'll move from my extreme position over here to a more moderate one. If I'm going to live up to the rule, I have to make a concession to you in return. I have to retreat from my initial position to a more moderate one. I know that would be the case if you did that, because it did happen to me a number of years ago. I was walking in front of my university library and was approached by a Boy Scout, 11 or 12 years old. He wanted me to buy tickets to the Boy Scout circus to be held at the local Coliseum that weekend, $5 a piece. I declined. But before I could walk away, he said, oh, well, if you can't buy our tickets, would you buy a couple of our chocolate bars here? They're only $1 a piece. And I bought 2 of his chocolate bars and immediately recognized that something important had happened because I don't like chocolate, but I do like dollars, and he had arranged for me to give him the dollars I liked for the chocolate I didn't like. So I scratched my head, I went back to my office, and I called a meeting of my research assistants to try to figure out what had just happened to me. And where they devoured the evidence, I want you to know. And we thought that this corollary to the general rule of reciprocation may have applied. After all, we began with incompatible positions. He wanted $5 a piece. I said no. He said, oh, well, if you can't do that, how about just $1 a piece for what I have to offer? And I wound up complying. And we thought, well, would this work on other people? Would it be a successful strategy to ask for a favor at this level by first beginning with a favor at this level, getting it turned down, and then retreating to the favor you were interested in all along? So here's what we did. We went out onto city streets in the Phoenix, Arizona area where I live and stopped passersby and told them that we were seeking volunteers. We were from the local county juvenile detention center. And we were asking them if they would be willing to chaperone a group of juvenile delinquents from the center on a day trip to the zoo. And you can imagine the great majority of people declined that opportunity. 83% declined. Only 17% were willing to comply. But for another group of passersby, randomly constituted now, we began with an even larger request. Would you be willing to be a counselor, kind of a big brother or big sister to one of the kids down at the center? This would require 3 hours of your time every week for the next 2 years. They blinked. 2 years? I don't even know where I'll be in 2 years, they said. Then, taking our cue from the Boy Scout, we said, oh, well, if you can't do that, would you be willing to chaperone a group of juvenile delinquents on a day trip to the zoo? Let me show you what happened. Whereas before 17% of the people complied, now 50% said, where do I sign? Tripling compliance with a large request, a substantial request, by adding one more breath to the request sequence, by creating a context of obligation in which we all respond to the draw of that rule. Another thing to be cautious of, another thing to be careful about. I should say, however, frequently it's the case that we do have let me come back to that at another point, maybe in the question and answer period, because right now I'd like to talk more about defending against these principles. But if you'd like, we can talk about the ethical implementation of these principles. Not just how to deflect them, but how to harness them in a way that actually benefits those involved. And we can do that maybe during question and answer. Okay.